Good morning to the children of Virginia and the children of America and the world. My name is Virgil Wood. I had the privilege of working with Dr. Martin Luther King for the whole 10 years of his national work, and with his father, we call affectionately known as Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., for 26 years. And as we observe this very day, April 4, 2018, exactly 50 years to the day that Martin Luther King was taken from us. And the final speech that he gave on the night before at the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee, it was the I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. Why was he so sure that we as a people would get to the promised land? The result of my experience over all these years is that there have always been people who embodied the promise and the prospect of America as a beloved land and a promised land. The picture to my right of Martin Luther King was painted by Mr. Samuel Green, who had come out of prison 1 year after Martin's death. My wife and I had the privilege of commissioning him to paint some pictures, but there's something about King saying, we as a people, and that's what I want to focus on now. Why was he so sure? Maybe it was because he had seen the results of his work in people like Samuel Green, who turned his life around from a life of crime to a life of productivity. Or maybe it was because he remembered that the heritage that shaped him was made up of people we call ancestors of the beloved community. And this brings us now to you, young people. And today I would ask a favor of you. I'm Virgil Wood. I'm a great grandpa, and I speak to you as much as a great grandpa, as much as a co-worker with Martin Luther King. I want you to think about ancestors, and I want you to think about elders, and I want you to think about other young people like yourselves. You are the promise that Martin Luther King saw from the mountaintop. And perhaps you will learn much of this from your own grandparents, perhaps, or maybe a teacher or a coach, people who love you, and they love you. And it is a wonderful mystery to figure out, why do they love me so much? So you will learn to hear their voice and to appreciate their experience, what they have learned, they pass on to you. And that's the reason we've done this Beloved Community Initiative, Ancestors of the Beloved Community. Virginia Union University and Virginia Tech have teamed up in this effort to bring this contest to you. And 6 months ago, you started your own essays on one of those pairs in black and white, ancestors of the beloved community and the American possibility. I'm delighted this morning to be joined by, first of all, Dr. Corey Walker of Virginia Union University and Dr. Sylvester Johnson of Virginia Tech. And we want to chat with you just a bit this morning about why we are so excited and why we are so deeply grateful to you young people who have taken part in this essay contest. And many of you have already submitted your essays, and others of you will do in this day, for it closes at the end of this day. And so I want now to have them share with you why they and their institutions have helped make this happen. Let's start with you, Dr. Walker.
Thanks so much, Virgil, and good morning to everyone. We really have this wonderful opportunity to remember a giant, one who's truly transformed the world and whose memory continues to transform the world. What we are doing today is continuing that audacious work of making the world a much more humane, much more civilized, and much more loving community. Our goal in this essay contest is to really garner the ideas and insights of a new generation of actors who are coming on stage. Much like yourselves, you gathered in Washington, D.C. at the Rally to Save Our Lives just a few weeks ago. You're continuing to mobilize on college campuses across the nation. When we look at the events at Howard University, when we look at the events across our nation, we see young people mobilizing. When we look across the world, we see young people in Brazil mobilizing. We see young people in South Africa continuing to mobilize to realize the dream of a united South Africa, a South Africa beyond apartheid. What all of these actions say is that the vision of King, the dream of a beloved community, is something that we all need to work for, and that in many of those situations, we follow the examples, the insights, and the ideas of young people. You provide us with the inspiration, with the energy, much more than that. You provide us with an imagination to exist beyond the world of what's given, to exist in the world where all lives are valued, to exist in the world where all human beings can rise to their fullest of their potential. You invite us to enter into a world where we are all part of creating a community where we all live in harmony with one another. A world where differences does not mean that individuals are devalued, but differences are celebrated, and differences become the way in which we unite around one another and the beautiful expanse of humanity and creation. We really need your voices right now. The reason why Virginia Union is a part of this effort and partnering with Virginia Tech is because we realize that we would not be here as an institution without the courageous efforts of young people who helped begin this institution in 1865. These young people not only helped start this institution, they helped change this nation. Throughout the history of Virginia Union University, we find young folks, our students, at the forefront of the struggle for new realms of freedom. The Richmond 34. When we think of desegregation in Richmond, we think of those students who marched off this campus right here in Richmond to downtown Richmond at the Thalheimer store to say no more, that Richmond, just like the world, must be a just and equitable place. We're a home to individuals like Dr. Virgil Wood, who came here, who was nurtured here by individuals like Samuel DeWitt Proctor, like Dr. Martin Luther King, who visited here a number of times throughout the 50s. What we find is individuals come to this place transformed by the vision of a dynamic and beloved community, and then go out and act in that manner to transform our world. We need you more than ever. We need young people more than ever. And it's not just you by yourselves. It is young people in conversation with our ancestors, in conversation with the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in conversation with those other elders like Ella Baker, in conversation with elders such as myself, who can then forge a new path for freedom, a new path for justice, a new path for equality. We thank you for taking time out this morning to join us as we reflect on the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But more importantly, we look forward to sharing your ideas, sharing your visions, sharing your imagination for a transformed world that will then really, so that we will be able to live into the beloved community that was at the core of Dr. King's vision and at the core of your visions for a transformed world, so that you may live to the fullest of your potential.
Thank you so much, Cora. It's absolutely, absolutely wonderful. Sylvester, would you share with
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Virgil Woods. It's very exciting to be here with you and Dr. Corey Walker. It's a real pleasure to join this platform and to participate in such a momentous initiative as a beloved community initiative. I serve as Assistant Vice Provost for the Humanities at Virginia Tech, and I'll be directing the new Humanities Center that is being established here. And I came to Virginia Tech because I was excited about the kinds of possibilities that this initiative actually represents. And that is taking very seriously and putting at the center of the mission of the academic work and the life of the university, the challenge of advancing the human condition, of taking seriously the humanistic import, the questions of our time. And I believe that there is nothing more urgent, there's nothing more valuable, there's nothing more important than coordinating our efforts in these educational institutions to ensure that we have a viable human future. If we don't have that, none of the other learning matters, none of the other initiatives matter. And so this initiative, this alliance, and this collaboration between Virginia Tech and Virginia Union is historic. It is very momentous, and it bespeaks some of the transformations that are happening here. One of the initiatives that we have put forward is a new strategic growth area for the university that is equity, social disparity, and the human condition. And that initiative is meant to coordinate the intellectual strengths in research and teaching, and especially in engagement beyond the university, in order to do precisely what this initiative is aiming to do. And that is to be impactful in a way that really energizes the potential of our young people, who are certainly university students, but even those who are writing these essays for this contest, who may one day be at these universities and who are going to be the sources of ideation for the changes that can achieve the justice and the equity that we seek. So I think it is especially significant that these universities have come together in order to support something that is so important. It's also important to consider the timing of this initiative. So this is 50 years past the loss of Martin Luther King Jr. and the movement that he was a part of. This was a mass movement that had global linkages, that had ties to the kinds of issues that Dr. Walker just spoke of. And those linkages always underscored the fact that it is impossible, as King emphasized, to disentangle the lives of any individual from the larger fabric of what they consider their own nation or society, but also beyond those national boundaries. It's impossible to disentangle the connections that we have across this globe. We're seeing unprecedented scales of inequality. The struggles for justice and equity have, from the past, have seen tremendous backlashes, but we've also seen new energies that remind us of what this essay contest is going to engage with. And that is the human courage, the ethical audacity to assert a new vision for what our society can be, even at a time when power elites, when cultural trends, when the economic formations might make it seem that those goals are exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to attain. The kind of courage that was the basis for a range of movements that was inspired and that was activated in part through the work of very young people to very senior, is actually what we are after. And that's why we want to encourage you to undertake this kind of work of studying the history of struggles for justice that are really become emblematic in what we know as the civil rights movement and what Martin Luther King Jr. was representative of. The young people of that movement were putting their lives on the line. They were arrested for the kinds of struggles that they engaged and the causes that they stood up for. If we think about the contemporary activism that we see in Black Lives Matter, for example, or in the recent demonstration in the National Mall that's responding to the gun violence that has rocked this nation, what we see is the kind of creativity and energy and leadership that can come from our youth. And we have to recognize the historical import of that, as well as its contemporary relevance. And so part of the aim as well of this type of contest is not just to educate and to support the acquisition of a knowledge of this complex history of struggle for justice, but also to recognize the place of our young people in supporting movements for equity, in advancing the vision that is going to make it possible for us to have a viable human future in which we are all flourishing. We think about the different figures from this time period, from this grand history, that are also relevant to Virginia. I mean, this is a state that has had figures from Thomas Jefferson, who, although he has been celebrated for his ideals of freedom, was a white supremacist who enslaved hundreds of human beings, to John Brown and Nat Turner, whose struggles against slavery were momentous. The kinds of activism that proceeded in this state through the work of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that people such as Ella Baker organized in order to capture the momentous energy that was coming from young people and to optimize that, to advance the kinds of possibilities that have rendered benefits that we have all enjoyed today, and to point the way for the future work that we have to undertake. So I'm very excited about what's going to emerge from this alliance that we have with Virginia Union, from the marvelous vision of Beloved Community Initiative that Dr. Virgil Wood has established, and especially the intellectual and the activists, the engaged alliances that are going to come forth from the work that you young people are doing in order to study what is truly really central to the success of our human society. And that is the very difficult but rewarding work of advancing justice, of creating equity, and making it possible for us to experience the fullness of our human existence in a way that is diverse, that is inclusive, and that is morally courageous. So I want to congratulate all of you students who are already doing this. I want to encourage those who have not participated yet in the contest to do so in the future. Well, we know that this is going to be a very generative enterprise. And so, again, I'm excited to be part of this.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Sylvester. This is just extraordinary indeed. I understand we may have some students who will be online with us, and we can continue this conversation with them. Do we have some yet, or?
We do have attendees online. We don't have any students as of yet.
All right, fine. We'll continue our conversation then. And if we do, you will let us know, and we'll stop right there. It's so important that we hear from these young folks. And also to say how grateful all of us are that some have already submitted their essays. We know we have some essays in hand, and we're looking forward to those that will come today. And also to say that there will be an opportunity, and it will be announced in the next several months, the continuation of this essay contest across the country. Do I see? Okay. There is a broader context that we're dealing with. Dr. Owen Caldwell and I have worked. I was 20 years old, and Martin Luther King was 22 when I first met him. I was a student at Virginia Union in 1951, and he had just concluded his seminary work at Crozer. He was advanced in his years in development because he had started Morehouse 2 years early. And so he was 22, I was 20. I was part of a small audience in one of the seminary students' suite. And there stood this guy. I'd never even seen him before, never heard his name really before. I had heard his daddy's name. And then 3 years later, I am then a graduate student at Andover Newton in Boston and pastor of the Pond Street Baptist Church that Sam Proctor had preceded by one person, myself. And Martin Luther King, it's now 1955. And Rosa Parks makes her a move by not moving. And history summons Martin Luther King into a role that he was reluctant to play. But we see him embrace that role. And about 6 weeks into that campaign, the Montgomery Improvement Association incidentally gives us a role model for how you might mobilize areas even that Martin Luther King might be involved in today, where he here today. There are several spots around America that I'm almost convinced he would be involved in right now, where people are suffering and at the end of their endurance and don't know what to do. And one of those places is a place that Virginia Tech has been involved, Flint, Michigan. Lead in the water, poisoning the children's potential future. Or it might be in one of the opioid addicted communities. I don't know, but I do know that because his legacy is a living legacy, although we have not allowed his voice much space since he's been gone. And I don't try to hide my disappointment and how little we've done with what he's left behind. The man believed so much that we as a people, that's all the people of the World House family, all the people, he was speaking primarily to his own African-American family, but he was meaning and intending clearly the people of the World House family and community. And so we of the African-American community have an opportunity, and I'm just overwhelmed with delight at the response that we now are seeing as Dr. Owen Codwell and I, as co-founders of the Jubilee National Collaborative, started with the Progressive National Baptist about 5 years ago in what we call, we developed something called the Freedom Family Kit to teach churches, our churches, how to welcome returning citizens, men and women like Samuel Green, who painted this painting. When we open up our hearts and our lives to these brothers and sisters, trying to make a comeback and a re-entry to society, when we work to make sure that the community that sent them to prison is not the community to which they are returning. And this is one of the legacies of King, yet unfulfilled. King left us 50 years ago. Black and brown people were in prison in the same percentage as the national population. Today, we are the overwhelming demographic in prisons. That's to our shame. Martin Luther King gave us the tools, techniques, and understanding of how to make a better nation, and that challenge is yet before us.
Excuse me, Dr. Wood, we just had a question come in.
Wonderful, let's hear
and
it.
It's actually along what you were just speaking about. It says, how do you feel the world has changed since the 50 years after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s last speech?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question, and I want to thank whomever that authored that question. Wonderful. First of all, let me talk to the ways I think America is so much better since Martin Luther King's time. I sometimes despair when I think about so much that's not happening. And then I come upon, surprisingly, upon situations where people have been at work in a quiet way, away from the camera, below the radar screen, doing the work of King. One of those places, I think, is where universities have begun to take seriously what's called service learning. I believe that has great potential for helping us to arrive at a place where there are crossover resources from the various disciplines focused on something that King said that just stirs me every time I think about it. When he said, he often talked about what he felt would be the necessity of giving his life, and that he would hope and pray that he would be willing to do it if it were required. And he would say, when I have to meet my day. One of those was around the issue of poverty. He said, if I have to give my life, I want to give it for poor people. What was Memphis? And if I have to give my life, I want to give it among poor people. What was Memphis? What are the cities of America today? Now, that's my tip towards some of the things that we can applaud. There is today a burgeoning Black middle class in America, a resource we didn't have when Martin left us. Perhaps the Black middle class was 20, 30%, and today it's 60%, which means that there's a resource base for getting done the work King left behind. His descendants, Black America, now handles $1 trillion cash flow each year. And so we can be the financiers of first line among our own people to turn around the predicament in which we find ourselves. And so I would simply say that we did not pay attention to rejoining each other after his death. We never got back to the upper room. If the disciples of Jesus had never gotten back to the upper room, I don't believe there would be a Christian movement today. They were faithful as we were unfaithful. And now the call is we must reassemble in the upper room and hear again his voice, not to overlay his voice with other stuff, but to hear the voice that he said, if I have to die, I want to die for poor people.
So, Dr. Wood, I also have a question,
yes,
particularly in the context of the young people who are participating in this contest. I think it's easy for many of them to see images of leaders of this movement as very mature people, as adults, and not recognize the role of youth in that activism. You just mentioned that when you met King, you were both in your young 20s.
Yes.
You were basically people who had, you're fresh out of college or are often college students or in that age range. And if you think about the fact that at that age, today, many people in their young 20s, they're still quote unquote finding themselves.
Yeah.
But you were part of this big movement. And then there were children who were part of that movement as well. And could you say a little bit about that context? Because I think what these students will be familiar with is the idea that adults were doing things, and they see those images of you and King and Ella Baker and Abernathy. And if you're only 10 or 12 years old, you can imagine that there's such a huge gap between you and those people. But actually, as you just pointed to, when you started this work, you were still quite young, and there were children who were part of this movement. So could you say a little bit about that part of the context and what it was like for the benefit of the students who are going to be doing this contest?
Yes, I'd be delighted. First of all, when I finally did what I think is a serious book on my work with King called In Love We Trust, Lessons I Learned from Martin Luther King, the more I've now advanced at this stage of my life, I realized that I had been privy to some very important resources before I met Martin Luther King. I was 16 and 17 years old. The elders of my community were dealing with a murder, literally a murder of a soldier in uniform. And they had felt, so the men of my community, I grew up in a little town west of Charlottesville, born in a hospital at Charlottesville, Virginia. The men of my community held a meeting, said, what are we going to do? They put me literally in the center of the room. My daddy was in the group. They literally put me in the center of the room and said, what are we going to do? I don't know why they did that. But what resulted was one of the businessmen in the group, he was a lumber company man, and I drove me to Richmond. We drove to Richmond and met with Oliver Hill and the law firm of Oliver Hill. And got that law firm engaged in that situation. And the result was a very handsome settlement for the widow of the soldier who had been killed wantonly by a young a young kid, a white boy whose sport was to drive through that little community at breakneck speed and to see people scatter like chickens. And this time he struck the body of Lewis Carter, and his body went 40 feet in the air and came down in pieces. And that was my introduction to this kind of work, 17 years old. But also when I was 17, the old folks in my community told me that Grandpa Jesse, who had been a slave, was not going to be with us very much longer. Get your notebook and your pencils and go and interview him. I spent a whole week sitting with Grandpa Jesse, hearing the story of our little settlement there. And he told me how it was that they came out of slavery and established this little community. And he said that the day they learned that they'd been set free, it was fresh in his memory, although it was all of those years. He's now 93, I'm 17. And he says they understood the context of what had happened to them was the Great Jubilee. And that's the framework of which Martin Luther King worked. And I think that we never understood the framework within which we were working. I asked Coretta later if she ever heard Martin make reference to the Jubilee, although his first sermon as pastor of Dexter was a Jubilee sermon, a Jubilee scripture, Luke 4:18, so forth. She said she had never heard him even use the term, but that's what we were doing. And I think if we had understood in the work that we were doing, young and old, that we were within a context where there was a baton being passed from one generation to another. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the young people receiving the baton from the older folk. It was as though Grandpa Jesse was passing through his other generations to me the baton of hope that the Jubilee represented. I would like to believe that when the very old and the very young have the conversation, so that the young do not have to learn by trial and error, so that, for example, they will learn even now that demonstration is not just about screaming and hollering because you're hurt. It's about setting a strategic target, stay on course to achieve it, and when you achieve it, stop marching and celebrate. And that's what I think could happen when the old folks and the young folks on a platform of respect sit down and talk about how are we all, old folks and young folks, going to get through this together on the other side, which is the side of the promised land. That's a long response to your wonderful question, but you have to excuse me. I'll be 87 tomorrow, and I can't seem to control myself when I start talking about this stuff. Do we have another question, Siobhan?
Great. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Wood, for that. We actually have three questions, and I will start with Dr. Walker. This question is geared towards you. This one says, Dr. Walker, with the Virginia Union history, how does it feel walking in the footsteps of giants like Proctor, Mays, and MLK and Dr. Wood and all the civil rights people that worked and visited Virginia Union University?
It is truly an awe-inspiring experience. I'm an alumnus of Virginia Union University. I graduated from the Proctor School 20 years ago in 1998. And being able to come back to my alma mater, to sit inside of my office is in Kingsley Hall. So Virgil, you understand Kingsley Hall, I'm sure. And to be able to lend my skills and talents to leading this historic institution is truly remarkable. I could not have imagined 20 years ago that I would return as a vice president and as dean of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. When I look at the history of this institution, I understand, even as a student when I was here, the rich history of Virginia Union. Not only a history of an institution that is past, but also a history that's continually being remade with new graduates. When I think of the work of a recent graduate like Rosalind Brock and her work at the NAACP as chair of the NAACP. When I look at our new alumni, when I think of our students graduating this year, we have so many students who are going to transform the world. It's an honor to be in this institution and in this place. We have a tagline here. It's called The Power of Place. Really, from this institution, these noble 9, now there's 5 of them, gray granite buildings, much like the granite buildings that we see, the Hokie Stone up at Virginia Tech. We find individuals who come into an institution who are not only shaped and molded by an institution, not only by its heritage and its history, but who then go on to leave their imprint on this institution. When I think of our current SGA president, Corshay Williams, who will go on to pursue her PhD in chemistry at MIT, I see a new generation of students who are forging forth in advancing new pathways for freedom, new avenues for liberation, new avenues for justice. I'm reminded that when King came here in 1957, King understood something. He understood that the issues that we face as a nation and as a world were not just personal issues. They were not just private concerns. Instead, they were structural issues, and they were very much institutionalized in the very fabric of the nation and of our world. He remarked a phrase, a statement that I continue to remark on. He stated, "There's something wrong with our world. There's something fundamentally and basically wrong. Inasmuch as we've made advancements, the students here at Virginia Union University remind us that there's still a basic structural wrongness in our society and in our nation. And it is that commitment to which they're geared toward remedy, geared toward transforming into a new world, geared toward transforming a new society, recognizing that their movements for change are not just movements geared toward the episodic or the isolated, but are geared to fundamental transformation of our society and our world." Right now, we have our undergraduate students and our graduate students at the march in Washington. They march, act against racism. And at that march, we have students who are coming together with students across this nation, with folks of all ages, all races, all geographic areas across this nation, to say no more. That the issue of racism, the problem of racism, is not a problem of one group or one particular isolated people. It is a problem of a nation. It is structural, it is institutional, and we have to root it out of the very fabric of our nation. This is what I really love about what Sylvester Johnson said, that when you think of some of our founding fathers, we think of them in a heroic manner. But in a manner, when we think of them in that manner, we evade the very structural issues that they set in motion by creating a nation that was structured in slavery, structured in anti-Black racism, structured in a gendered inequality against the worth, value, and dignity of women, and structured in in a fundamental way such that those who have not continue to have not, and those who have continue to get more. Those are the issues that we're gathered here today to begin to challenge, to begin to cultivate young people, to work from the space of this historic Black institution. Virginia Union University provides us with a unique platform. To then leverage that platform with our partners at Virginia Tech is an opportunity for us to bring these two historic institutions together to really address those deep institutional and systemic inequalities that continue to devaluate human life and human existence. We are committed to doing that. It is our mission, it is our goal, it is why we were founded. And I'm so very proud to join with Virgil Wood, our illustrious alum, and to join with my dear friend Sylvester Johnson and the great team at Virginia Tech to continue that work, such that the vision that this institution was started, a vision of an institution that really was a vision about increasing the potential of human possibility in the world, so that then we can scale that for all individuals, not only across the Commonwealth, but across the entire world. That's our vision, and that's what we're committed to. And I'm just honored to be able to do that from my alma mater, Virginia Union University.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. And with that, we'll move right into Dr. Johnson's question, which kind of piggybacks on what you just said. But with your efforts in focusing on humanity and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People Campaign, do you think it is still possible to cure poverty? If so, why is it not being done? Should young people be marching for this as well?
That's a terrific question because it has to do with vision and possibility. The quick answer to that question is, of course. There's nothing natural and ineluctable about poverty. Poverty is not a destiny. It's not some super cosmic plan for the world. It's a result of how we organize our societies. It's a result of individual and collective, especially structural decisions that control how we do what we do, how we handle wealth, how we express value and for who gets valued, who gets devalued. All of these things are choices. That doesn't mean that it's easy to address these problems, but it's not because they're impossible, and it's not because we cannot change and transform our society. So I think that point about agency is very significant. Otherwise, we can carry on as if there is no real solution to these problems, when in fact, we know the solutions, we know the challenges, and there's no single step as part of that. What's required is a broad set of practices, a broad set of changes. And a lot of this has to do with political will. A lot of it has to do with historicizing these systems so that we don't naturalize poverty and just think, well, we're always going to have poor people, or we're always going to have inequality. There's nothing we can do about it. It's just the way things are. It's not the way things are. People fought very hard to create this inequality. Going back to several points that have already been made by Dr. Walker and Dr. Wood, is that the society that we live in, locally and globally, is a history of triumph. It's a history of struggle. It's a history of organized oppression. You're talking about the displacement of indigenous people. That was work. People lived here, millions of people in the Americas who were forced from their lands. It took militarism, it took money, it took training troops to kill them, to depopulate their cities, to force them to march for hundreds of miles, and thousands of them died during that process. It meant creating a reservation system. That's how we have a United States of America, because we dispossessed Native people from these lands. And it meant creating an indentured servant system for white immigrants, creating a eugenics system in the 20th century that targeted European immigrants. It meant creating a class-structured racism. People actually thought up these things, and they worked hard to make them happen so that we could have inequality. It actually takes work to make things unequal on that scale. And it's going to take work to bring it to what it should be, to make it equal. So one of the points about the young people, should they be organizing to demand things? Absolutely. We have seen multiple examples of that. I pointed to the examples of Black Lives, which encompasses many people, but one of the distinguishing points about that movement is that it has heavily involved young people, and not in an exclusive fashion, not exclusive to anyone else, but the involvement of youth in Black Lives Matter is very evident. And if we look at the recent demonstrations that have happened from young people organizing around a range of issues, anti-racism, we saw this in Charlottesville, we see this in the National Mall. Those have been very urgent demands for justice. Being vocal is very important. And so we should support and encourage everyone, particularly youths, to to demonstrate and to articulate their demands for justice. That doesn't mean that nothing else should happen. It means that it's important to give that public face, to give that public voice, so that we send a clear message to political elites. We send a clear message to allies who might not be able to be out there with them, or who might wonder if anyone really cares enough to speak up on behalf of these issues. In addition to those things, we also have to change the popular narratives that we have about our society. And that's why this essay contest is actually very important, because it's creating an opportunity for young people to really understand what is actually a complicated history. I mean, the king is a case in point. Who was he? So one of the posts that I saw this morning was by one of the African-American faculty members here, Wernie Reed, who heads the Center for Race and Social Policy. And one of his points is that King's message has been whitewashed. He's typically portrayed as someone who stood for peace, and by peace, that usually gets used to try to silence people who are agitating for justice. King was an agitator. So he wasn't promoting peace in that way. He was demanding justice. And what he taught is that we needed to disrupt society in a fundamental way, non-violently, but disruptively, in order to demand changes and to make people do things that they didn't want to do. So one of the reasons that legal segregation was ended in this country, it was not because segregationists wanted to end it. They were forced to. They didn't actually want to do that. And so that message is very important. But students need to understand that. And once youth understand the radical nature of someone like King and the radical nature of these movements, it can inspire them, their own creativity and activism, to not just honor those histories through an intellectual exercise, but actually to embody it in our own time. So yes, we can absolutely end poverty. The scale of wealth in this country and this world is more than sufficient for the population of human beings in this world. It took a lot of work to create the massive inequality that we have today. You can take the carceral system. Prisons aren't cheap, and they don't grow out of the ground. People have to build them. They have to maintain them, even when those systems are not sustainable, even when it might not make financial and economic sense. So it takes work to create inequality, and it's going to take work to bring it to what it should be. But absolutely, it can happen. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. So with that question, we will have one more question, and it is addressed to all panelists. And we will start with Dr. Walker, then Dr. Johnson, and then let Dr. Wood wrap us on up. So the question is, we often talk about Dr. Martin Luther King's dream and his friends. May each of you give us, young people, your dream for us. How do you see us in 50 years?
That's probably one of the most difficult questions to ask. I guess the dream that I would have is the same dream, is along the lines of King's dream. And his dream is really a dream about possibility. It's really a dream about imagination. It's really a dream about human creativity. It's a dream about human being and belonging in the world. It's a dream about creating a much more just, a much more equitable, a much more humane existence for all of creation, not just how we live as humans, but King was very much concerned with how we have instrumentalized the environment, such that right now we're facing a climate crisis. We're facing not only a climate crisis, we're facing a man-made crisis in terms of how we access resources for human life and human flourishing. What I imagine is something that I go back to from my daughter. My daughter had, one time we were living in Providence, and then I was a professor at Brown, and I was we were on the way to up to my office, and she said, "Daddy, you know what?" And I looked at her and I said, "What, Cameron?" She said, "Anything is possible in the future." Daddy, you know what? Anything is possible in the future. And I said, "Cameron, you're exactly right. Anything is possible in the future." That is my vision of the future. It came from my daughter. At the time, she was 7 years old. She gave me a vision of the future, a vision that anything is possible. If we continue to work with the tenacity, the strength that we have in the human condition, and we are committed to those ethical norms that value the worth, value, and dignity of all of human life, and we understand human life as being inextricably related to all of creation, and we revalue creation itself, then 50 years from now, we will realize King's dream. It will be a lot of work. It will be a totally new and transformed world. It will not be a world that we can imagine even today. But I am heartened by the words of a 7-year-old. Daddy, you know what? Anything is possible in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. Dr. Johnson, would you like to give a stab at it?
Yes, this is a terrific question. I agree wholeheartedly with what Dr. Walker was saying. I would just want to add to that I hope that young people never allow anyone else to control their ability to imagine what they can do, and that no one convinces them to foreclose on possibilities of the future. And I mean that in some particular ways. I'll go back to Black Lives Matter. That movement began to be criminalized at its inception. I had a student at a former institution where I worked who was being prosecuted as a terrorist because of his participation in Black Lives Matter. And that activity is that strategy of trying to intimidate our young people into not advancing justice, into not demanding equality, is unfortunately not a new tactic. It's a very old one. We know it under different names: COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program of police departments and the FBI. Coordinating is a long history of that. And when I say intimidation, that's the kind of thing that I mean. The practice of criminalizing people, of cowing them, activists who are young people speaking up on behalf of the rights of Palestinians have been prosecuted on college campuses because there's a movement to try to define that as anti-Semitism, when in fact they're demanding human rights for people. And it's a way of intimidation. So my hope and my vision is that our young people will continue to be courageous, that they will continue to be bold in their imagination, that they will balance respect for an engagement with people who are more mature than they are, who are often controlling the civic and political institutions of our society and the military institutions of our society, while also cultivating the audacity to be unconstrained by those people who might wittingly or unwittingly try to discourage them, dismiss them, complain that they're not doing things the way it was done 50 years ago or what have you. They need to invent things to do in their own way. They don't need to be limited by us. They don't need to be controlled by us. They need to be in alliance with us. And so that's my hope. And
thank you, Dr. Johnson. Oh, did you have something else?
No, I was just gonna go to Dr. Wood if you weren't, but go ahead. I know he's gonna close us out. So.
Okay, Dr. Wood.
Yes, before I respond to that, I want to respond to the previous question about why have we not eliminated poverty. I think that, first of all, Black folks are as guilty as white folks in why we still have poverty. That's number one. I'll tell you why. We would rather talk about reparations than to collect the damn debt When we went to Washington in 63, the first thing out of Martin Luther King's mouth was, we've come to deal with a bad check. We're still dealing with a bad check. And who has the moral authority to make that happen except the descendants of African slaves? DAS, D-A-S, descendants of African slaves are the claimants to the unpaid debt, compounded. That's a whole lot of money. Suppose there are people right now who want to make a down payment on the debt. Who they gonna write the check to? Well, you know who they oughtn't to write it to. I wouldn't write it to them either. But I'm gonna tell you something. Thomas Jefferson and others like him on their deathbed. Thomas Jefferson was broke. How's that for a smart businessman? Died in foreclosure. But he decreed that his slaves were to be set free. I think we need to go back to that moment when these slaveholders and so-called founders of the American Republic instituted this whole system. They crafted it carefully, right? Now, on their deathbed, they said, I want to fix what I broke. George Wallace, and the end of his life, was a partner with Martin Luther King in bringing about a beloved America and a beloved economy. But we're so intent on keeping them in their former state of the horns rather than the halo. Here's what I want to say. I think we can do this thing. I'm telling you, at 87, I hope to see us on first base with this thing. And we can get there, but we have to learn from our past. Listen, y'all don't need to make the same mistakes we've made, but you won't even know it if you don't talk with us because we haven't put it in the books. The real mistakes we made are not in the book, and you're not going to get it if you don't sit down and talk with us. Young folks, you can go out there and scream and holler all you want, but it's just a temper tantrum unless there's a strategic goal in place and you have the metrics to determine when you have gone from one increment to another increment. So I want to say, first of all, Black folks got to lead this. We've got to reverse the jail trail and jumpstart viable economy. Somebody read that in my book about reversing the jail trail and came up with something called the cradle to prison pipeline. If you think our predicament is a pipeline, you're stuck. If you understand that it's a trail that you can reverse, and if you understand anything about Malcolm at all, Malcolm showed us how do you turn prisons into universities. That's the challenge to Virginia Union and Virginia Tech, to carry the best of what you've got behind the prison walls. And in 10 years, we'll be finished with this mass incarceration system. For one, that's right, that's one of those. But the other is, why do we still have poverty? Because Black folks got free, middle-class Black folks got free, and now our white brothers and sisters who are still stuck in poverty without a different reason than we're stuck in poverty. In other words, Senator Byrd says, my people have become white niggers. We're afraid of that term because it's toxic. We're afraid of it because we have not understood the dynamics of niggerization of America. America niggerized Black folks, but it didn't take. It didn't take with us, but the folks who are on opioids now, it did take. And so the descendants of African slaves, we got to put our arms around our poor white brothers and sisters and let them know that Martin Luther King as the Calvary came for them too. Now, that's what I want to say about poverty right now. This is the other thing. This movement has a broader context than these two universities. They have been invited in as partners in a movement that's ongoing. The Jubilee National Collaborative intends to mobilize the resources of wherever they can come from to reach down to the bottom of our society and let our brothers and sisters on the bottom know that King came for them and we are for them too. And together we will rise, and together we will create a beloved America. I wrote a poem based on, and this is my hope for the children. I've got two great-grandchildren. One is 3 years old, a little girl. I got a grandson, 6 months old. And so my dream is for them. Somebody was asked once, what is your dream for your grandchildren when you're gone? What is it you could wish for them? What is the greatest thing you could wish for them when you are gone? And I love his answer. And I'm going to give it after I read this poem. I'm going to close with this poem based on 2 Chronicles 7:14. How to help America make the turn from a wrong past to a bright new future. It's called Beloved America. We're named and called by God, humbling and praying to seek God's face, turning from our past wrongs. America, America, forgiven and healed right now, to dwell in peace, prosperity is good for one and all. Beloved America, King, Lincoln, Kennedy, and Johnson forged a nobler creed for one and all to be an American. Stand tall and reach the stars, and let us every nation be, and be for one and all. Oh, beloved America, red, white, black, yellow, brown, from every nation we have come to live here now in peace. America, America, God grant us grace that we will find our true and nobler voice for one humanity. Oh, beloved America, our country is for all. Why can't we find a better way to make it really so? America, America, God mend thine every flaw. Help us make up and lift the ones who need a helping hand. Oh, beloved America, love, joy, and peace for all, patience and kindness, long-suffering, faithfulness, self-control. America, America, goodness from one and all, till all the virtues from above are seen and felt below. Meet us in Charlottesville, August the 28th, 2018. More to come. Thank you. And thank you, Corey Walker and Sylvester Johnson, for this wonderful moment and the work that we have put our hands to the plow in order to do. And God bless you.
Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you. I'm excited and honored to be partnering with this. So thanks to you both.